These two experiences happened within a month of each other. The first one happened to my brother-in-law, and the second I witnessed firsthand. Back in 2007, my sister and her husband lived with my mom and me. I was in middle school at the time. One Saturday night, my brother-in-law was working at his security job, while my sister, mom, and I were at a church function. These church services usually lasted until around 8:30 p.m., so we didn't get home until about 9 o'clock. That night, we pulled into our mobile home. Normally, my brother-in-law would be inside waiting for us, but instead, he was standing outside by himself, looking like he had seen a ghost. As we pulled into the carport, I noticed that all the lights were off inside the house. When we got out of the car, he lifted his hand, pointed at the house, and said in a shaken voice, "I'm not going in there by myself." We asked him what happened, and this is what he told us. I came home and was walking into the carport, about to enter the house, when I heard what sounded like a group of people talking and laughing inside. I heard silverware and dishes clinking, like there was some kind of dinner party going on, but all the lights were off. I thought you guys were trying to prank me or something. So I went up the steps and pulled out my house key. The whole time, I could still hear muffled chatter, laughing, and even music. But as soon as I put the house key into the doorknob, I heard someone go "th," and then the entire house went silent, like everything just stopped at once. As soon as I opened the door, I heard what sounded like an understir stampede of people running in the opposite direction. At this point, I started to think it wasn't a prank. I thought maybe some people had broken into the house and were trying to leave before they got caught. So I ran around to the back of the house to cut them off at the back door. But when I got there, everything was quiet again. I thought maybe whoever was inside didn't run out because they knew I was on the other side. So I sprinted back to the front door, opened it, and ran inside. It was quiet and pitch black. I turned on all the lights and cleared the entire house, but nothing was out of place. Nothing at all to indicate anyone had been there. That's when I ran outside to wait for you guys. The second occurrence happened a month later in the same house. My mom was out doing something, I don't remember what, and my sister and her husband were on a date. Halo 3 had just come out, and my brother-in-law kept his Xbox in his room. Before he left that night, I begged him to let me play the game while he was gone, and he reluctantly agreed. So I had the whole house to myself. I turned on all the lights in the house for obvious reasons, but since I wanted the full effect of the video game, I turned off the light in my brother-in-law's room, so the only light was coming from the TV. As I played, I felt like someone was walking around in the house. When you live in a mobile home, you can feel every movement. I paused the game and waited to hear something. After a few moments of silence, I decided to say something. "Hello!" No response. I went back to playing the game, brushing off the noise. But a few moments later, I saw a shadow under the door from the corner of my eye. I paused the game again and looked directly at the door, and the shadow moved out of sight. At first, I thought someone had come home early, so I called out again but got no response. Now I was starting to get a little freaked out, sitting in the dark room, trying to hear any noises in the house. Suddenly, I heard the refrigerator door open. Everybody knows that sound. I got up and opened the door to check. I looked to the left, where the kitchen was. The refrigerator door was closed, but the kitchen light was off. In fact, all the lights on the left side of the house were off. At this point, I was low-key starting to panic, thinking there was a burglar or something in the house. I quietly walked to the living room, keeping my eye on the dark dining room area, and turned on the TV, blasting the volume as loud as I could. Then I turned on the kitchen light, which slightly illuminated the dining room. I quickly turned on the dining room light and jumped into the middle of the room, yelling, hoping to scare off any trespassers. But no one was there. I ran through the entire house as fast as I could, bashing doors open and yelling as I went. No one else was inside, and all the doors and windows were closed and locked. If someone had opened the fridge, they wouldn't have had enough time to get past the door to escape without me seeing them. Shaken, I went back into my brother-in-law's room, locked the door, and cranked the TV volume again, playing Halo 3 until my mom got home. I know that our landlord's parents had both died inside that house, of old age, but the kitchen and dining room were where most of the activity seemed to take place. Before this, I didn't really believe in ghosts or demonic entities, but experiences like these can definitely change your perspective. Who doesn't love a good ghost story, especially around the holidays? I've reviewed countless paranormal accounts, read articles, and watched TV shows. Until it happens to you, it's hard to believe these stories. Some seem more plausible than others, but most you hear today feel exaggerated. That said, I ask that you keep an open mind. My goal in sharing this story is not to convince anyone of the paranormal's existence, but to share my experience. Perhaps someone has gone through something similar and can feel reassured that they aren't alone. I'll warn you, though, things are about to get pretty deep. Back in law school, my professor would say, "It's hard to remain objective in subjective reality," and I couldn't agree more. My grandfather co-founded one of Canada's largest pharmaceutical companies, and my father eventually became its CEO. Though I love my family, I'm not blind to the unfair practices of Big Pharma. I chose labor law, hoping to protect people from being taken advantage of, but even so, the good guys don't always win. This story isn't about that, though. Let's turn back the clock to the winter of 1985, around Christmas. Though my grandfather founded the company in Canada, my father was born in New England, and that's where my sister and I grew up. Every year, my father and grandfather would go on hunting trips in upstate New York, where my grandparents owned an old manor, and we'd spend Christmases there. The manor was enormous, 3 stories tall, with a fountain out front and thick forest all around. It had originally been built as a hospital in colonial times, and, as you can imagine, it had its fair share of ghost stories. My sister Natalia and I were more interested in playing hide and seek in its long corridors, though. We were never allowed in the large basement where my grandparents stored antiques, but naturally, we tried to get in whenever we could. The door was always locked. Yet, in December of 1985, everything changed. My father and grandfather were off hunting, and my mother and grandmother were Christmas shopping in town. I was 15 and Natalia was 12, and since we were old enough to be left alone, we decided to try the basement door again. To our surprise, the old handle turned, and the door swung open with a creak. I flipped a switch on the wall, and a single bulb flickered to life, revealing old wooden stairs descending into darkness. We went down the stairs, but only the small area around us was lit. Natalia went back to grab a pair of flashlights, and when she returned, the beams revealed a maze of old sheets covering unknown objects, like something out of the others. We started uncovering items that looked interesting, mostly antique tables, chairs, and shelves that we were too young to appreciate. At the very back of the basement, we found a corridor about 30 feet long, but it abruptly stopped at a wall. At the end of this corridor, we noticed an object mounted to the wall and covered by a dirty white sheet. Curiosity got the best of us, and we pulled off the sheet, revealing an old, cracked mirror with a worn, carved frame. At first, I couldn't make out my reflection, but then I saw it, an old man staring back at me. I dropped my flashlight, stumbling backward in fear. My sister looked up and saw my terrified expression. She gave me a confused look, then quickly stood up to see for herself. When she did, she went still, then began to tremble visibly. I got to my feet and looked into the mirror. Aside from our frightened expressions, our reflections looked normal. I placed a hand on her shoulder to comfort her, but before I could say a word, she let out a shriek of terror, loud enough to shatter the silence. She bolted back up the stairs, leaving me alone in the dim light. I glanced one last time at my reflection, turned off the light, and followed her upstairs. Natalia was inconsolable, crying in bed for the rest of the night. From that day forward, she wasn't the same. She became cold and distant, plagued by nightmares where she'd wake up screaming, always while staring into her dresser mirror. Whatever she saw in that mirror in the basement scarred her deeply. I tried talking to her about it over the years, but she'd always shut me down, once even threatening to kill me if I mentioned it again. Eventually, her behavior was diagnosed as schizophrenia, and her night terrors turned into sleepwalking. She'd go to different mirrors in our house, staring at her reflection for hours before screaming. Her once happy drawings of family became disturbing depictions of a mangled woman with half her face missing. as her condition worsened. She was put on a cocktail of medications that stopped the screaming but left her a shell of herself. This tore our family apart, causing constant fights between my parents. My father wanted to commit her to a hospital, but my mother was against it, and eventually they divorced. After I graduated, my father rented an apartment for me so I could attend college. As difficult as it was, I didn't want to be around Natalia anymore. Sometime later, I got a call from my dad. I could tell from his voice that he had bad news. Natalia had wandered away from home one night and onto a busy highway. Several witnesses saw her throw herself in front of a speeding semi-truck. At her funeral, as her casket was lowered, I kept thinking about that mirror in my grandparents' basement. Whatever she saw in it haunted her until her last day, and I couldn't help but wonder what had caused her so much fear. Years later, after my mother passed away, I came across a box marked Natalie while sorting through her things. At the bottom of the box was a folder containing her old drawings. The final drawing answered my question. It was of a little girl staring into a mirror, her reflection showing the mangled face of a woman with half her face missing. This happened over the course of a year, beginning in the fall of 2005 when I moved into Goldstein Hall for my freshman year of college. Goldstein Hall was a typical 3-story dormitory, built in the 60s, and it had definitely seen better days. My room was nothing fancy, just your standard cinderblock dorm room, but it was home for the year. I quickly threw myself into the college lifestyle. Classes, sports, parties, and of course, living off pizza. Everything seemed normal at first. My roommate, Alex, was a shy kid who loved computers and watching football. He was homesick though and spent a lot of time back at home, which meant I had the room to myself most of the time. One day, while typing up a paper on my computer, I felt a chill run down my back as the TV suddenly turned on by itself. Creeped out, I tried to brush it off, telling myself I must have accidentally hit the remote. Though I knew the remote was on my bed, strange things kept happening. I'd hear knocks at my window with no one there, or see the door slam shut as if hit by a gust of wind, even though the windows were closed. Once, I came home to find my radio on, despite having turned it off before leaving for class. Things started to go missing or move around, like my Phillies baseball cap, which I couldn't find for a week, only to have it suddenly reappear on top of my computer. There was even a strong smell of cologne in the room sometimes, even though neither Alex nor I wore any. I kept trying to explain it away, but with each strange incident, it became harder to convince myself that nothing was wrong. The weirdest thing that semester happened one Thursday night. Alex and I were watching a football game when, out of nowhere, the microwave turned on for 5 seconds and then stopped. We looked at each other but didn't say a word, just went back to the game. Alex ended up skipping his Friday classes and immediately went home the next day. At the end of the semester, Alex decided to transfer schools. I wasn't too surprised, as I knew he wasn't really happy there. After finals, I helped him pack up his car. My family wasn't picking me up for winter break until the next day, so I had time. As we finished loading up, Alex looked at me seriously and said, "I don't know how you can stand being in that room. You know what I'm talking about." I let out a deep breath. "Yeah, I know. I'll be fine." We shook hands, and I watched him leave Goldstein Hall for the last time. Nothing strange happened that night, and over winter break, I managed to convince myself that I had just been imagining things. The new semester started in mid-January 2006. I was excited about my new roommate, Matthew, who was redshirting for the football team. He seemed like a nice guy, though we didn't have much in common. He stayed for about a week before suddenly switching to another dorm, without even saying a word to me. I came home from class one day and all his stuff was just gone. After Matthew left, all the strange things from the previous semester started happening again. The truth was, I didn't mind too much because it meant I had a double room to myself at the price of a single. I tried to cope by drinking more. Hey, I was 19 at the time. I learned to ignore the weird stuff, like when the TV would flicker on, or when my favorite sweater ended up on my bed after I'd left it in the closet. Sometimes I'd hear rustling from the top bunk, even though I was the only one in the room. Denial is a beautiful thing. In early April, I got really drunk at a lacrosse party. drunk enough that my friends Mason and Ryan had to walk me home and help me into bed. I remember them placing a trash can next to the bed in case I got sick. I passed out almost immediately. Suddenly, I felt water splash across my face. A guy I didn't recognize was standing over me, holding a water bottle. He was short and stocky, with blonde hair and brown eyes. He yelled at me, "There's a fire. You need to get out." Still half drunk, I grabbed my phone and stumbled out of the building, with the fire alarms blaring and sprinklers going off. The guy was right behind me until I lost him in the crowd of residents gathered in the parking lot. It turned out that some drunk idiot had set off firecrackers in the second floor common area, causing a fire. We were allowed back in the dorm 2 weeks later, after they repaired the water damage. When I got back, nothing strange happened for the remaining 2 weeks of the semester, but I couldn't shake the image of that guy. I tried looking for him, but no one seemed to know who he was. The year eventually ended, and I left Goldstein Hall for good. Fast forward to Halloween weekend, 2006. I had moved back home and was commuting to school, having had enough of dorm life. I became friends with a guy from my drama class named John, and one Saturday afternoon we were studying in the library for a test. Given that it was Halloween weekend, we started talking about weird experiences. I mentioned the strange occurrences in Goldstein Hall. John looked at me and said, "You know, a kid died there in the 80s, right?" My uncle went to school here at the time. John told me that in April of 1986, a group of frat guys set off a smoke bomb in the common area, starting a fire. A student, Kevin W. Anderson, died of smoke inhalation while trying to escape. Spooked, I asked if John wanted to check the yearbook archives in the library, and he agreed. We found the 1986 yearbook, and I froze when I saw the memorial page for Kevin W. Anderson. His picture matched exactly the face of the guy who had woken me up the night of the fire. It's been 10 years since I first set foot in that house, and what I experienced there remains the most terrifying experience of my life. As someone who has encountered the strange, the unexplained, and the frightening more than most people, I don't say this lightly. To better explain things, let me put it this way. I've always been able to sense spirits. I can feel their presence, distinguish whether they are male or female, and sometimes even pick up on their emotions. Because of this, I'm usually unfazed by paranormal experiences. But a trip I took with my closest friends changed everything for me. In 2010, I visited what is essentially the Mecca for fans of my favorite TV show. Although the series was filmed in a studio, the exterior shots of a particular house were used as the residence of the main characters. That house, however, is private property. You can't just knock on the door and take a look around. You have to reserve a room to stay there. That's why the chance to be there was so special. I received an invitation through a dear friend who happened to know the owners. They were hosting a Halloween party to raise funds for restoring the house, and a select few people were invited to stay for several days. I was ecstatic. The house was old, grand, and full of history. It had 3 floors, a basement, and an attic. Almost every part of the mansion had a story, the kind of place I dreamed of visiting. My best friend, who I've known for 7 or 8 years at that point, was with me. She's the stereotypical New Yorker, sarcastic, quick to call out nonsense, and one of the smartest people I know. She's also a huge sci-fi nerd and my regular travel companion. Naturally, we roomed together for the trip. What wasn't natural, however, was the high level of paranormal activity taking place in the house. Like many old mansions, this one had its fair share of spirits. Most of them didn't bother me. In fact, I found some of them comforting. There was a little girl in the attic who tugged on my shirt and spoke to me. A man walked the corridors near the grand staircase and even saved me from falling down the marble steps. I also sensed the original owner and his wife in the basement and ballroom. But in the wing where the old servants' quarters were located, something was different, something darker. The mansion was full of life during our stay, with people in almost every room. My friend and I were given one of the smaller rooms in the servants' quarters wing, and from the moment I stepped into it, I felt a sense of dread. It was as if something was watching me, almost predatory. My eyes were drawn to an empty corner, and I could see him, a male spirit. He stared at me intently, like a starving animal. I turned to my friend and said, "There's a man staring at me in the corner." She brushed it off. "It's an old house. You're just imagining things." But I wasn't. He just kept staring. That night, I fell asleep easily, even though I normally have trouble sleeping in new places. The next day passed in a blur of exploration, fun, and laughter. Yet, every time I entered that room, I felt his eyes on me. By the time the Halloween party rolled around, I had almost forgotten about the spirit. Dressed in a heavy, regal gown, I spent the night dancing and celebrating with my friends. By the early morning of October 31st, I was exhausted and eager to get out of my dress. The house was quiet when I returned to our room. My friend was already fast asleep, and I locked the door behind me before changing into my nightgown. As I pulled the dress over my head, I felt it again, his eyes watching me. I froze, vulnerable and naked. He was there, staring. I quickly covered myself and tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. I turned off the lights, crawled into my sleeping bag on the air mattress, and tried to fall asleep. But as I lay there, I heard someone calling my name. "Catherine." It was soft at first, but unmistakable. I ignored it, thinking it was just my imagination. "Catherine," the voice repeated, clearer this time. I still ignored it, telling myself it would go away. But then it came a third time, "Catherine," more urgent. The room had become freezing cold, and the air felt charged, like it was electrified. Suddenly, I heard footsteps coming from the corner of the room. His footsteps. He was there. I was frozen with fear as I heard him walk closer, slow and deliberate. He crouched next to my air mattress, and I felt a large hand clamp over my mouth, silencing my sobs as he violated me. In my head, I started praying, chanting anything I could think of. Half-remembered prayers, mantras, pleas for help. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he froze and disappeared. I bolted upright, flung my sleeping bag off, and turned on the light. There was no one there. My friend was still sound asleep, and the door was locked. I was shaking so badly, I could barely breathe. I ran out of the room, down the dark hallway, desperate to find someone, anyone. I stumbled across two of my friends and babbled incoherently about what had just happened. They had never seen me like that before, but they immediately believed me. They told me I couldn't go back to that room, and I agreed. I felt cold, realizing I was still in my nightgown, so I turned back to get my robe. But when I approached the door, I realized it was locked. My friend was still inside, snoring. I knocked, but she didn't wake up. I could still sense that dark spirit inside the room, taunting me. He wanted me to beg him to open the door, but I couldn't. I left and spent the rest of the night in the solarium, curled up next to the fireplace, waiting for someone to return. Eventually, some drunk partygoers wandered in, and I told one of them about what had happened. We stayed up talking until the sun rose, but I never went back to that room. The next morning, I asked a friend, who was even more sensitive to spirits than I am, to come to my room. Without telling him what had happened, I led him inside. As soon as we stepped through the door, he froze, staring at the same corner. "Catherine, you can't stay here tonight," he said gravely. "Get all your stuff and don't leave anything here. Never come back to this room." "What about my friend?" I asked, glancing at her bed. "He's not after her. He wants you." My blood ran cold. I quickly grabbed my things and moved across the hall to an empty room, where nothing happened for the rest of the trip. I returned to the mansion the following year for another Halloween party, but things had changed. My boyfriend had proposed earlier that year, but we broke up just before the trip. I ended up rooming with my best friend again. We were assigned to the same room where I had felt safe during the final night of my last stay, just across the hall from the Dark Spirits room. I thought I would be okay, but I wasn't. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. I could feel him. He was coming for me. I saw the door rattle, shake, and then stop. He was gone, but I couldn't move until the sun came up. The next morning, I found a red apple placed in front of the door to our room. I knew it was a message, meant for me, I had reached my breaking point. I packed up, moved to another part of the house, and never returned to that wing again. Even after all these years, I can still feel him there, waiting for me in the dark. I want to share a story from my childhood. I've never been sensitive to the paranormal, but there was one encounter that left a lasting impact on me. I grew up in a small town in northern New Hampshire, just a stone's throw away from the Canadian border. After my grandmother passed away in 1996, my family moved into her house across town. I never met her due to a complicated relationship between her and my father. More on that later. The house was an old, two-story building that looked like a Victorian home, but with a strange, mismatched appearance, as if two houses had been built close together and later merged into one. Most of the upstairs bedrooms had severely slanted ceilings due to the awkward architecture, and I used to call them pizza slice rooms. My parents stayed in the master bedroom downstairs, and I was told to pick one of the upstairs rooms. Most of them were pizza slices, but there was one room on the opposite side of the hallway that looked normal, so I chose that one. For the first 2 months, things were uneventful. But one night, that changed. It was storming outside, and I couldn't sleep. I kept feeling an itchy sensation on the back of my head, and my throat burned like I had an infection. I was about to get up and grab some water when I saw someone standing in the doorway, a middle-aged man, glaring at me. I had no idea who he was. I tried to scream, but the burning sensation in my throat made it impossible. The man turned around, and just as lightning lit up the room, I saw something that terrified me. The back of his head was missing, replaced by a gaping hole where his brain should have been, with bits of flesh hanging out. I was only 7 at the time. I'd never seen anything like that before. The man vanished, and I bolted out of the room, running into my parents' bedroom. After my mom calmed me down, I told her what I had seen. My parents exchanged worried glances but didn't say much. They didn't even try to tell me it was a nightmare. They just let me sleep in their room for the rest of the night. The next day, my dad moved all my stuff into one of the pizza slice rooms. I watched as he hammered boards over my old bedroom door. When I asked why, this is what he told me. "Son, I'm going to tell you the truth, and you're going to have to be a man and deal with it. Your grandfather was an evil, cruel bastard who hated life so much he ended it himself. That's who you saw last night, and I think he chose that room to do it in. It's not a good idea for anyone to go in there anymore." And that was that. I stayed in one of the pizza slice rooms until I left for college in 2009. Years later, I found out the full story. My grandfather had been an abusive alcoholic who ultimately ended his life with a shotgun. My father explained that my grandmother had refused to intervene in the abuse and even blamed my dad for his father's suicide. My dad hadn't been living at the house when it happened, so he didn't know which room his father had used. But after what I saw, he was convinced it had been that room. We eventually moved out of the house after I left for college, and my dad sold the property to a developer on the condition that they demolish.